She gave everything, and he fired her anyway, for 7 years. Grace Miller was the quiet force behind a billion-dollar empire, calm, precise, and always one step ahead. She knew how Benjamin Lockridge liked his coffee, how to fix a deal before it fell apart, and how to hold together a company run by a man who rarely said, "Thank you." And then, one day, with a single mistake that wasn't even hers, he let her go. Imagine giving your best years to someone, staying late, biting your tongue, holding the weight so they could shine, and when something goes wrong, you're the one they blame. You're the one they push out. What would you do? Would you walk away quietly, or would you rise not in anger, but with dignity and show the world your worth? This is the story of the woman who did just that. Let it remind you the ones behind the scenes often carry more power than anyone knows, until the day they stop staying silent. If this story touches you, leave a comment. Share your thoughts. We read everyone. Now, come with me. Let's begin. For 7 years. She sat at the same desk just outside his office, quiet, reliable, invisible, until the day he told her to leave. The morning sunlight streamed through the high glass windows of the 27th floor, casting a warm glow across the polished floor of Lockridge Holdings. The city moved below, like a restless tide, yellow cabs weaving through crosswalks. Early commuters hunched against the wind, horns echoing between buildings. Inside, Grace Miller sat at her familiar spot, the desk just outside the CEO's office. Her desk, a corner tucked between the glass wall and the hallway, with a view of the skyline only she seemed to appreciate. To most, it was just a space, but to Grace, it had become her anchor. 7 years. That's how long she had worked here. Not in the spotlight, not with applause, but with consistency. Every morning at 7:15, she arrived 15 minutes before anyone else. She liked the quiet. She liked the rhythm of unpacking her tote bag lunch she made herself, a leather-bound planner, and the navy blue mug that simply read, "Gracefully done." It was a gift from an intern 3 years ago. No one else had noticed her birthday. Her fingers danced effortlessly across the keyboard, checking Benjamin's calendar, scanning investor reports, cross-referencing meeting agendas, and triple-checking the printed contracts that would slide across his desk before noon. She caught errors that others missed, anticipated problems before they arrived. She didn't brag about it. She didn't need to. Benjamin Lockridge never said much. At 45, he was younger than most of the CEOs in Midtown. Sharp suits, sharper decisions. He built the company from the ground up with the kind of relentlessness that either inspired fear or respect, or both. He rarely smiled, rarely paused, rarely looked up from his phone, but he trusted Grace. In his own way, when others came and went, she stayed. He never said it, but she knew. He depended on her. She understood his rhythms, his patterns, even his silences. That morning had started like any other. Grace had prepped the investor brief, organized the latest compliance memos, and left a handwritten note beside his espresso. Flight to Chicago rescheduled to 6:45 p.m. Weather delay, I've updated your itinerary. She'd even slipped a small pack of ginger chews into his laptop bag. He got nauseous on small jets, something he never admitted aloud. But she had learned after a turbulent trip 3 years ago. It wasn't affection, it was attention, the kind that goes unseen until it's gone. At 9:12 a.m., Benjamin emerged from his office, brows furrowed, jaw set. He didn't look at her. "Come in." Grace followed him in, clutching her tablet, ready to take notes. But something was off. A file sat open on his desk. The Kepler account, one of the company's biggest. A minor discrepancy had been flagged in the contract language regarding liability clauses. The client was furious. Benjamin's voice was sharp. "Did you review this before it went out?" "I did," she replied, calm but firm. That clause was unchanged from legal's final draft. "I flagged a different issue, but you flagged the wrong one." He cut her off. "This delay just cost us the entire pitch. They're pulling back." She didn't flinch. She had learned long ago not to react to heat with heat. "I'm sorry," she said softly. But I did raise a concern. It may not have been the one they caught, but Grace, he snapped, I don't have time for this. We needed perfection. There it was. The unspoken rule of Lockridge Holdings. No mistakes, no excuses. He stared at her cold, unreadable, and then, just like that, he said the words, "You're dismissed, effective immediately." She blinked, not out of shock, but from the sting behind her eyes. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them, like wiping a whiteboard, like clearing a tab, like she had never existed. He didn't say thank you, didn't ask her side, didn't even look back when she quietly gathered her things and left the room. The hallway felt longer than usual as she walked past her desk, the one by the window. She picked up her mug, the gracefully done one. She didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later. Instead, she paused for a moment to take one last look at the skyline. New York was still there, still pulsing, still loud and moving and impossible to pin down. And for the first time in 7 years, she wasn't part of this floor's rhythm anymore. The elevator dinged softly as the doors opened. She stepped in. No one said goodbye, no one even noticed. But somewhere inside her chest, something stirred. Not anger, not sorrow, something else. Something that felt like a door cracking open. She didn't know it yet, but this was not the end of her story. It was just the beginning. When the person holding everything together disappears, everything else starts to fall. The morning after Grace left, the office carried on, at least on the surface. The same elevator chime echoed through the marble lobby. The same low hum of printers and coffee machines filled the halls. People walked briskly in suits, nodding, murmuring greetings, clutching their tablets and schedules like lifelines. But something had shifted, subtle, but real, like the air had changed, like a frame had been removed from a picture no one realized needed it. Benjamin Lockridge didn't notice it at first. He arrived at 8:35 sharp, as always, black coffee in one hand, phone in the other. His new assistant, Clara, had been hired overnight through the HR firm on retainer. A top recommendation, they'd said, quick learner, detail-oriented, polished. She smiled brightly as he stepped off the elevator. Good morning, Mr. Lockridge. Your 9 a.m. meeting has been moved to 10:30. The reschedule request came in last night. I adjusted everything accordingly. He gave a small nod, barely slowing his stride. Fine. Inside his office, he found his usual folder waiting on the desk. Investor reports, meeting agenda, contracts to sign. But as he flipped through the pages, a strange feeling crept in, like picking up a familiar book, only to find the chapters out of order. One memo was printed twice. Another had missing figures. The Kepler summary had the wrong date in the header. They were small mistakes, nothing catastrophic, nothing to yell about. But Grace would never have missed them. Still, Benjamin pushed the thought aside. Transition takes time, he told himself. He had more important things to focus on. The day rolled forward. The office kept moving, but the rhythm was off. The espresso machine in the break room sputtered. Someone had forgotten to order more beans. An executive arrived 30 minutes early for a private lunch with Benjamin. Clara had misread AM for PM. A call with a European partner had to be cut short because the Zoom link expired. By Wednesday, there were whispers. They didn't even give her a farewell. I thought she ran the whole calendar. She never got credit, but now you can tell who really kept this place from falling apart. Benjamin ignored it all. He worked late. He skipped lunch. He read the memos twice, sometimes 3 times. He didn't know why he kept checking. He'd never needed to double-check before. That Thursday morning, it happened. A high-profile investor meeting was scheduled with the Barrett Group, an old money firm based out of Boston. They were considering a large stake in Lockridge Holdings ahead of the IPO. Benjamin had been preparing for weeks. At 10:05 a.m., he was still reviewing notes in his office when his phone buzzed. "Sir," Clara said on the line, voice shaky. "Mr. Barrett's team is in the lobby. They say their meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. Benjamin blinked. I had them down for 1 p.m. That's what was in the calendar. A silence followed. He could hear his own pulse thudding. "Apologize and bring them up. Now," he said, tone clipped. But by the time the investors reached the boardroom, the tone had changed. They were polite, but distant. The conversation was short, barely 20 minutes. One of them glanced at his watch 3 times before standing up and saying, "Perhaps another time would be better." As they left, Benjamin remained seated at the head of the long table, the untouched presentation flickering on the screen behind him. A single misstep. That's all it took. He returned to his office and closed the door quietly behind him. The floor seemed louder than usual, the click of heels, the ring of phones, the low buzz of conversation just outside. He looked out the tall windows for a moment, then turned his gaze inward. His eyes landed on the empty desk just beyond the glass wall. Grace's desk, still tidy, untouched. The small plant she kept by the window had been taken, leaving behind a faint circular imprint on the wood. Her chair was slightly askew, as if she had just stepped away. It was strange, the way absence had a shape, how silence could echo louder than voices. He remembered the way she always stood to greet visitors before he did, the way she would glance at his watch during meetings, signaling when to wrap up, the way her handwritten notes slipped between pages, guiding him without ever speaking a word. It wasn't just the scheduling, or the contracts, or the coffee. It was the invisible architecture she had built around him, quiet, steady, unseen. And now, it was gone. Still, pride was a stubborn thing. He didn't say her name, didn't ask Clara to find her contact, didn't acknowledge the mistake that had begun it all. Instead, he stood, adjusted his tie, and turned his attention back to the screen. But his focus had dimmed, the numbers blurred, the headlines lost weight. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice had begun to whisper, "You've lost more than you think. When your most loyal ally walks away, your greatest enemy walks in." It had been 5 days since Grace walked out of Lockridge Holdings. 5 long, quiet days. The first morning was the hardest. She woke at 6:00 out of habit, her body still trained to the rhythm of early meetings and inbox triage. Her apartment, a small but tidy second-floor walk-up in Brooklyn, was silent. No calendar alerts, no vibration from her work phone. Just the creak of the floorboard when she stepped into the kitchen and the familiar rattle of the radiator waking slowly with the heat. She poured herself a cup of tea instead of her usual office coffee. Sat at her tiny round kitchen table, the one with the chipped edge and mismatched chairs, and stared out the window at the narrow street below. A delivery truck passed. A man in a hoodie walked a golden retriever. The city moved on. By the 3rd day, she had updated her resume, though the document felt strange to write. 7 years condensed into bullet points. There was no section for absorbing silent frustrations, or being the only person who remembered he hated cold sandwiches. There was no metric to explain how many small fires she'd quietly put out before they ever reached his door. By the 4th, she was reorganizing her pantry and alphabetizing her spice rack, trying not to think too much. She had scrubbed the grout in her bathroom tiles, refolded every towel in the linen closet, and started baking something she hadn't done in years. And then came the 5th day. She was standing by the window, folding laundry, when her phone rang. Unknown number? She nearly let it go to voicemail, but something in her gut stirred an old instinct that told her this was a call worth answering. She picked up. "Grace," came the voice, smooth and unmistakably confident. Elliot Marsh. Her heart skipped once, then settled. Elliot Marsh, CEO of Arvista Capital, competitor, former suitor for her talent, not her heart. He had tried to recruit her 3 years ago after a high-stakes panel she had quietly orchestrated behind the scenes. She remembered the lunch, a small, elegant trattoria near Gramercy Park. He'd complimented her instincts, her precision, her discretion. "You're the spine of Lockridge Holdings," he'd said. "Benjamin leans on you more than he admits." She had declined back then, not because she wasn't flattered, but because, well, she still believed in loyalty, in quiet service, in holding things together. Now, His voice carried a different tone, less charm, more calculation. "I heard about the change in your employment status," he said, matter-of-factly. "I was surprised, though maybe I shouldn't have been." Grace said nothing. "I'm calling because we have a role that I think would suit you. Director of Strategic Partnerships. It's high level, but you'd have full authority. No gatekeeping, no ego battles. You'd report directly to me." The offer hung in the air like a coat left on a door. Heavy, present, not entirely unwelcome. "We've admired your work for a long time," he continued. "Frankly, we always knew Benjamin was underutilizing you." She could hear the unspoken jab beneath the compliment, and it made her spine tighten. Still, her voice was calm. "I'm not looking for anything at the moment," she said quietly. Elliot's chuckle came softly through the line. "People like you never look. That's why you're invaluable. But think about it. We're offering 40% more than what you were making. You'll have a team, resources, creative control, and above all, respect." She said thank you and ended the call politely. Then she stood at her sink, staring out at the alley behind her building. She didn't want to be tempted. She didn't want to need this. But there were bills on the table, and not just electricity or groceries. There was a letter from the bank. She opened it now, though she already knew what it said. Her mortgage application had been denied. Her dream of buying a small co-op apartment just 3 subway stops away done. No verified income, no employer listed. She sat for a long time, her fingers brushing over the envelope. The rejection wasn't what stung. What stung was how invisible her work had become the moment she stopped doing it. She thought of all the nights she stayed late without logging extra hours, the weekends she drafted investor briefings while eating takeout, the family events she missed, the birthdays she forgot her own included. What had it all been for? Later that evening, she called her mother. They talked about safe things, the cat, the neighbors, the recipe for peach cobbler. Grace didn't mention the offer, but before hanging up, her mother said gently, "Don't forget, baby, you're allowed to want more." That night, Grace lay awake staring at the ceiling, her room aglow with city light leaking through the blinds. She tried to count the number of things she had said no to over the years for the sake of stability, of service, of someone else's success. She lost count somewhere after 20. The next morning, she brewed her tea, watched the steam rise, and scrolled back to her call log. Her thumb hovered. Then, with a quiet breath, she pressed call. "Elliot," she said when he answered. "I'm not making promises, but I'll meet with you. I'll hear you out." It was just a meeting, just a conversation. She didn't know then that she was stepping onto a chessboard, and the game had already begun. Not every collapse comes with a bang. Some unravel quietly, thread by thread. The decline began with the little things: an email not sent, a report filed under the wrong quarter. A recurring meeting inexplicably vanished from the calendar, leaving 3 executives standing awkwardly in a glass-walled conference room. No one noticed it at first, not fully. Benjamin certainly didn't. He was used to order, to rhythm, to efficiency that just happened. His days had flowed with clockwork precision for so long. He never paused to consider how that precision was maintained. But now, the machine coughed. Small frictions surfaced in meetings. One executive showed up late to a quarterly review because the agenda had the wrong time zone. A new assistant, bright, ambitious, and painfully green, accidentally forwarded a confidential vendor dispute to an entire email list. A lunch with a board member had to be rescheduled because no one had remembered Benjamin's aversion to seafood. He began to feel it by the second week, a subtle dissonance, like trying to walk across a floor where one tile is slightly loose beneath the carpet. His sleep fractured at night. He lay in bed beneath imported Egyptian cotton sheets, the city humming distantly beyond the glass. And he thought about things he didn't want to admit, about the empty space outside his office door, about how no one now greeted him with a steaming mug of black coffee at precisely 8:27 a bowl, made exactly how he liked it. No sugar, just the faintest splash of oat milk. about how meetings didn't start on time anymore, or end when they should, or come with the quiet, color-coded folders Grace used to leave on his desk. Tabs perfectly aligned, her handwritten notes in the margins sharp as needles. He told himself this was just growing pains, adjustment. The new assistant would learn. The team would find its footing. He wasn't dependent on one person. But deep down, a small voice whispered something less comfortable. Maybe she wasn't just an assistant. Maybe she was the glue, the one holding everything together while he raced ahead, eyes fixed on the horizon. The tension in the office thickened. There were whispers now, long glances exchanged in elevators, a certain stiffness in meetings. Middle managers stayed quiet longer. Department heads double-checked before speaking. Someone in marketing forwarded the wrong draft of a client pitch. Again. An investor follow-up call was missed entirely because no one had placed it on the schedule. The finance department sent Benjamin a report with a missing page missing an entire page. He slammed the folder closed, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. Was this what unraveling felt like? It wasn't loud. It wasn't fire and fury. It was quiet, like water seeping into wood rot, spreading invisibly until the whole structure warped. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning. Benjamin arrived at the office a few minutes early. He couldn't sleep anyway. The building was still half asleep, the city outside cloaked in early light. He walked through the executive floor, coffee in hand, when his assistant called out nervously, "Sir, I think you'll want to see this." She held out a copy of the financial ledger. A folded tab stuck out from the business section. He took it with a half nod and unfolded the page. There, in black print, under the headline, "Leadership Drift at Lockridge Holdings," was a brutal analysis, anonymous sources, whispers from inside, hints that the once impeccable engine of Lockridge Holdings had begun to sputter. The article didn't name names, but it didn't need to. It described a notable change in executive functioning and a sudden void in operational stability. One sentence, near the end, hit like a punch. Insiders point to the abrupt departure of a longtime executive assistant known for her precision and discretion as the moment when the gears began to slip. He read it twice, then a third time. The article wasn't damning, not yet, but it was enough to raise eyebrows, enough to plant doubt in investor meetings, boardrooms, and negotiation tables. He walked slowly into his office and shut the door behind him. The room was exactly as it always had been. Polished desk, minimalist decor, soft whir of the HVAC, but it felt emptier than usual. He sat down, the paper still in his hand, and stared at the corner of his desk. There was a small indentation in the wood, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It was from the ceramic coaster Grace used to place his coffee cup on, always in the same spot, always warm by the time he arrived. He reached out slowly, set his own paper cup down in the same place. It didn't feel the same. He looked through the glass wall that separated his office from the open space outside. The desk was still there, unoccupied, a few stray papers stacked in a corner. Someone had left a potted plant, trying to fill the absence. But it wasn't the same desk anymore. Not really. It had lost its rhythm, its stillness, the quiet hum of calm in a world that never stopped moving. And for the first time in a long time, Benjamin Lockridge felt something deeper than frustration, something that looked a little like regret. He picked up the paper again, stared at the words, "Sudden void." He leaned back in his chair, the city stretching wide beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows. For a man who'd built his empire on control, the silence felt louder than any storm. And somewhere, just beyond the noise of the city, the real storm was already gathering. The biggest mistakes aren't in the paperwork. They're in the people we fail to protect. The office was unusually quiet for a Tuesday. Benjamin sat in the glass-paneled conference room, arms folded, jaw tense. In front of him, a thick file lay unopened, the file that had triggered Grace's dismissal nearly 3 weeks ago, the file he had thrown on the desk in a storm of frustration and bruised pride. Across the table, Natalie Vaughn, a legal counsel from compliance, cleared her throat gently. "I wanted to bring this to you in person," she said. Her tone was professional, but there was a hesitation beneath it, as if she were weighing each word before speaking. Benjamin didn't respond, just gestured for her to continue. I've been reviewing the contract Grace was blamed for, she said. The one with the Liberty Holdings clause. He nodded once. Tight. And there was an error, she said. But it wasn't Grace's. He blinked. Natalie tapped the document with a red pen. The clause in question was edited by the AI assistance system that legal's been piloting for the last 2 months. It auto-corrected a line referencing liability conditions, changed a comma placement, and inverted a key phrase. Benjamin leaned forward. She was the last one to touch it. Yes. Natalie nodded, but she flagged it. She slid a printed screenshot across the table. Highlighted in pale yellow was a comment Grace's comment attached to the line in question. AI revision seems off. Recheck phrasing before finalization. She caught it, Natalie said quietly. Left a note. It looks like the assistant at the time didn't see it, or didn't know what to do with it. And the system finalized the version without legal approval. Benjamin stared at the note. It was unmistakably her precise, concise, clear, no drama, no panic, just her usual quiet efficiency. He began, but the words caught in his throat. I thought you'd want to know, Natalie said, gathering her papers. I'll update the internal records. She left the room softly, her heels tapping a slow retreat down the hall. Benjamin didn't move for a long time. Outside the glass, the office buzzed on, phones ringing, fingers on keyboards, voices rising and falling in low conversation. But in that conference room, time stilled. The guilt came slow, like cold water soaking into warm soil. A quiet, creeping awareness that settled into his chest and refused to leave. He had fired her, without letting her explain, without reading the note, without listening. All it would have taken was one more minute, one more breath of patience, one conversation. He stood up suddenly, walking briskly back to his office. Once inside, he sat down and pulled open his email archive. He hadn't looked at it since she left. He couldn't. But now, fingers hovering over the keyboard, he typed her name, Grace Miller. A list of messages appeared, hundreds of them. Calendar confirmations, flight details, meeting prep notes, all time-stamped, all signed off with a tiny dash and the letter G. He scrolled to the last one. It was sent the night before she was dismissed. Time-stamped, 11:14 p.m. Subject RE Thursday briefing. Benjamin, materials are finalized. Flagged one AI change that looks odd, note added. Also, don't forget your mother's birthday is Friday. G. But that wasn't the final email. There was one more, sent just 3 hours after she left the building with her things in a cardboard box. Subject no reply needed. Take care of yourself. You forget sometimes. Benjamin stared at the screen. She had been angry, rightfully so, but she hadn't yelled, hadn't defended herself at length, hadn't pleaded to stay. She had simply left with dignity and sent him kindness on her way out. He let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. The realization landed not with a crash, but with a quiet ache. He hadn't just lost an assistant. He had lost her grace, her steadiness, the unspoken support that had held up the foundation of his life without demanding attention. And worse, he had pushed her out, with sharp words, with assumptions, with a complete failure to do the very thing he had always prided himself on thinking critically. The error wasn't in the contract. The error was in him. He sat in the silence, the faint whir of the HVAC overhead, and looked once more at the email on his screen. Take care of yourself. You forget sometimes. He hadn't realized until now how much those words mattered. Not just the reminder, but the fact that someone had cared enough to notice. He looked at the desk outside his office again, empty except for a half-dead plant someone had forgotten to water. The space felt colder than before. It wasn't just her absence. It was the echo of all the things he'd missed while she was there. And in that moment, Benjamin Lockridge finally understood Grace hadn't just made things easier. She had made him better, And without her, things weren't just falling apart. He was. He stared out the window as the sky darkened with the promise of rain, and somewhere beneath the weight of his own regret, a quiet resolution began to take shape. He needed to make this right. But how do you begin to fix something when the damage is already done? Sometimes, the hardest doors to knock on are the ones we shut ourselves. Brooklyn looked different when you weren't looking down at it from the 58th floor. Benjamin had never noticed the chipped paint on the brownstones, or the quiet rhythm of early evening mothers calling kids in from stoops, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the creak of old floorboards heard faintly through open windows. He stood on the front step of a modest apartment building, hands deep in the pockets of his wool coat, heart beating harder than it had during any boardroom showdown. The folder tucked beneath his arm felt heavier than it was. Or maybe it was the weight of what he'd come to say. The hardest doors to knock on are the ones you shut yourself. He raised his hand, paused, then knocked. Seconds passed, then the door opened with a soft click. Grace stood there in a simple navy cardigan, her hair pulled loosely back, no heels, no badge, no iPad in hand, just her at home, in her space, no longer orbiting his. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped back, polite but distant. "You found me?" He offered a small smile. "Your address was in the HR file. I hope this isn't an intrusion." She didn't answer that, just motioned toward the modest living room. He stepped inside. The apartment was small but warm, books stacked in neat piles on the side table. A soft light glowed from a floor lamp. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the windowsill, next to a blooming pot of lavender. It struck him suddenly this quiet life she had built outside his world. He had never imagined her life beyond the office. Never asked. And here it was, unfolding around him in small, lived-in details. She sat on the arm of a faded couch and waited. He remained standing. "I was wrong," he said. No preamble, about the contract, about everything. Really. Grace looked at him, unmoving. "I found your note," he continued, voice low. "You flagged the error. It wasn't your fault. You were doing your job, better than anyone." Silence stretched between them, not hostile, just careful. "I should have listened," he said. Still, she didn't interrupt, just studied him with the same even gaze he used to find so reassuring during tense meetings. Now, it made him uncomfortable for good reason. "And I should have let you speak. I didn't give you that chance. I reacted, not as a leader, not even as a decent person. I just reacted." He took a breath. His throat felt tight. "I came to apologize." A pause. Grace nodded slowly. "Thank you." Simple, quiet, but not dismissive. He shifted his weight. "There's more." She raised an eyebrow. Just slightly. He set the folder down on the coffee table. Gently. "I want you to come back," he said. "Not as my assistant. That would be beyond insulting." Her expression didn't change, but the silence grew heavier. "I need help rebuilding Lockridge Holdings. Not just structurally, but culturally, strategically. I can't fix this alone." He gestured to the folder. "It's a formal offer. Chief Strategy Officer. Full decision-making power, equity stake. You'd be my partner. Now." She looked away for the first time since he arrived. Her gaze landed on the lavender by the window. "Why me?" she asked. He hesitated. "Because you've always seen what I didn't. You've understood the people behind the numbers. You ran that company, Grace, more than I ever realized. And because I trust your judgment more than I trust my own." Grace stood and walked to the window. The city stretched beyond, golden light fading into early dusk. She sipped her tea, thoughtful. "You once told me," she said slowly, "that loyalty was measured by how quietly someone did their job." He remembered. It was during a company retreat years ago. He'd said it without much thought, another CEO platitude. She turned to face him now. But loyalty isn't silence, Benjamin. It's speaking up, even when it's hard, and listening when you'd rather not. I know, he said quietly. I learned that the hard way. She looked down at the offer, then back at him. I'm not saying no, she said. He exhaled softly. But this, she tapped the folder. This doesn't fix what happened. I understand. You can't buy back trust with a title, she added, and you can't restore respect overnight. He nodded. I wouldn't expect you to forget, or even to forgive. Not yet. There was another pause, gentler this time. I'll think about it, she said finally, but not because of the role, because of what I believe the company could become. He gave a small nod. That's all I ask. As he turned to leave, she called out gently, Benjamin. He stopped. Take care of yourself, she said, softly echoing the words from her last email. He turned, met her eyes. There was no smile, no warmth, just quiet truth. You forget sometimes, she added, and just like that, the door between them cracked open, not wide, not yet, but enough for something new to begin. Respect is not given with titles, it's earned through change. The elevator chimed as it reached the top floor, and Grace stepped out onto the familiar carpeted hallway. It had been 2 months, but the scent of lemon polish and the low hum of muted conversations felt like echoes from another lifetime. Everything looked the same, polished, pristine, professional, but nothing felt the same. She walked past the framed photos of Lockridge Holdings' milestones product launches, global partnerships, industry awards. In each one, Benjamin stood at the center, tall and composed. And somewhere just beyond the camera's lens, she had been there too, unseen, essential. Now, she wasn't just returning, she was rewriting the terms. The boardroom doors opened silently as she approached. Inside, 7 people sat around the long table, faces she knew, some better than others. Benjamin stood at the far end, arms loosely folded, eyes watching her with a calm she hadn't seen in him before. She took her seat across from the board, placing a thick folder in front of her. I appreciate you giving me this time, she began, voice steady. I know this isn't a typical meeting. There were polite nods, cautious smiles. A few eyes flicked toward Benjamin, uncertain of where this was going. I'm here, she continued, because Benjamin asked me to return. Not as an assistant, but as a partner. That caught their attention. But I'm not interested in coming back to the same company I left. Her fingers opened the folder. Each board member received a copy of the proposal, pages neatly tabbed and marked. I'm proposing 3 major changes as conditions of my return. A short silence followed. Then, she began. First, the company must address its internal culture. That means moving away from top-down pressure and fear-based management, and toward transparency, empathy, and accountability. People stay loyal when they're seen, heard, not when they're afraid of making a mistake. The older man to her left, Mr. Harold Kavanaugh, furrowed his brow. Grace, I don't mean to sound dismissive, but this is a business, not a therapy group. Culture shifts take years. We don't have time for soft reform. Grace met his gaze directly. We also don't have time for repeated resignations, PR crises, or missed opportunities because people are too afraid to speak up. If you want performance, invest in trust. A few murmurs followed. She moved to the second point. Second, we need a complete review of our HR practices, terminations, grievances, performance evaluations. Everything must be transparent and subject to oversight. What happened to me could happen to anyone here, and that should scare you, the woman across the table. Susan Lively, head of compliance, nodded slightly. Folding her hands, third, Grace said, her tone softening. Executive leadership needs to participate directly in mentorship and internal development. That includes Benjamin. He leads the vision, but he also needs to lead the people. Now came the shift in the room. There was a ripple of discomfort. Someone cleared their throat, Someone else shifted in their seat. You're asking the CEO of a billion-dollar company to run training seminars, Kavanaugh scoffed lightly. That's a misuse of executive bandwidth. No, Grace said quietly. It's the most powerful use of it. She turned to Benjamin. And he agrees. Benjamin straightened, nodding once. I do. I've led this company through markets and mergers, but I haven't led its people well. Grace is right. I need to do more than just show up in meetings and sign off on numbers. He looked around the room. I've made mistakes. Big ones, and it nearly cost us everything. If Grace is willing to come back, we should be willing to meet her where she stands. The room fell quiet. The board members exchanged glances, some skeptical, some intrigued, some, like Susan, thoughtful. Then Kavanaugh leaned forward. These changes, they'll cause disruption. We'll lose people. Clients might worry. Then let them. Grace replied, Better we lose what isn't aligned with our future than hold on to what's rotting us from the inside. It was bold, but she didn't flinch. A silence hung heavy again. Then a slow nod from Susan. I think, she said carefully, this is exactly what we need. If we want to stay relevant not just in business, but in principle. One by one, the others followed. Some with reluctance, but none with outright refusal. The vote passed, not unanimous, but enough. Grace exhaled slowly. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. As the room cleared, Benjamin remained behind. He waited until it was just the two of them. You didn't hold back, he said with a wry smile. I wasn't supposed to, she replied. He nodded. You're right about the mentoring. I used to think leadership meant being the smartest one in the room. It doesn't, Grace said gently. It means making others feel like they belong in it. There was a pause. Then she added, You're learning. That's what matters. They walked together down the hall toward her new office. It was just a few doors down from his. Glass walls, high ceilings, and a view of the Hudson. As they reached the door, Grace turned to him. This is a beginning, she said, not a reward. I know. I'm not here because you made space for me. I'm here because I claimed it. Benjamin nodded. And I'll do my part to make sure you never have to fight for that space again. She looked at him and for the first time smiled. A real one. They stepped into the new office, not as CEO and assistant, not as employer and employee, but as two people building something better. And outside, the city kept humming. When dignity returns to a place, so does loyalty. The office felt different now. It wasn't in the decor still all marble floors and glass walls, cold and modern. It wasn't in the layout or the skyline view outside Grace's new corner office. It was in the way people looked up when she passed, not out of obligation, but out of hope. Grace had returned not as a shadow, but as a partner, no longer the woman behind the calendar invites or the one who ensured the coffee was warm and the documents were alphabetized. Now, her title read Chief Strategy Officer. But more than the new title, it was the way she carried herself anchored, composed, and quietly commanding that made it clear she was here to build, not to fix. Her first week back, she created a list titled Reconnections. On it were names of employees who had left Lockridge Holdings during the storm, middle managers, team leads, longtime assistants, and a few department heads. Many had left without exit interviews. Some had walked away after being overlooked or overworked for too long. A few had written resignation letters that never got responses. She remembered their birthdays, their kids' names, the way they worked through lunch, the way they stayed late not because they were told to, but because they cared, and they deserved more than silence. So Grace picked up the phone. She didn't delegate the task to HR. She called each of them personally, one by one. Hi, this is Grace Miller. I'm calling not as your former colleague, but as someone who believes in what you used to bring here. I know the way things ended might have left a bitter taste, but I'd like to talk. If you're open, some declined, some hesitated, but a surprising number said yes by Thursday. 3 had already agreed to come back. not because of the paycheck, but because they sensed something had shifted. In their interviews, they asked questions, real ones. Will we finally be heard? What happens when mistakes are made? Is the culture really different or just under new branding? Grace answered with transparency, not spin. She showed them a restructuring plan that included a people-first policy, flattened hierarchies, and feedback loops. She offered mentorship programs not just for junior staff, but peer-to-peer accountability sessions that would include even senior management, and she kept her own door open, physically and symbolically. Beyond employees, the next battlefront was external, the investors, and few were more influential than Thomas Wexler, a man as old school as his wool suits and fountain pens. For decades, he'd backed companies like Lockridge Holdings, favoring confident visionaries with cold efficiency. But after the recent instability, he had started pulling away, slowly draining his capital from the firm. Benjamin had once impressed him. Now, the cracks had dulled that shine. Grace scheduled a one-on-one with Wexler in the quiet of a Thursday morning. No presentation decks, no assistants, just her, a notepad, and the conviction of someone who had had enough time to understand both the company's fractures and its future. Wexler looked at her over the rim of his tea. "You're not here to ask for more time, are you?" "No," she said. "I'm here to ask for a second chance, but not for Benjamin, for the people, for the soul of the company." His eyebrow lifted. She continued, "We've focused too long on preserving image. I'm here to build integrity, not because it looks good in a quarterly report, but because that's the only kind of business that survives the next storm." There was a long silence, then a small, unexpected nod. "You've got something he never did," Wexler murmured. "Grace?" She smiled softly. "Fitting. Isn't it?" The next day, his legal team called Wexler Capital would restore a portion of their funding, with the condition that Grace remain part of executive decision-making for all strategic pivots. Not Benjamin, Grace. Back at Lockridge Holdings, word spread, and not just about Wexler. Employees returned from lunch breaks to find shared inboxes reorganized, workflows simplified, and performance reviews rewritten in plain, human language. Grace worked with department heads to eliminate the archaic rating system. Instead, reviews became dialogues. What's working, what's not? Where do you want to grow? Even the receptionist, a young man named Caleb, found a surprise in his inbox. A personalized note from Grace, thanking him for how he greeted visitors and how often he stayed late to help confused clients find their way. "People notice," she wrote, "I did, and people did notice in turn." Late one evening, Benjamin stood outside Grace's office. The lights were still on, though the rest of the building had gone quiet. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. She looked up, her expression calm. "You've been busy," he said. "So have you." She replied, "I heard Wexler called you directly." He did. Benjamin looked around her office. Clean, efficient. A whiteboard on the wall held scribbles of strategy sessions, staff notes, and in the corner, 3 words underlined in blue people: process, purpose. "You've already made this place better," he said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't do it alone, but you started it." She paused, then said gently, "The tide's turning." "Benjamin, but tides don't stay turned unless you protect the shoreline." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. As he left, Grace remained at her desk, flipping open a blank page in her notebook. She stared out the window for a moment, and then, without hesitation, began to write the next chapter. At the same table where she once poured coffee, now, she signs million-dollar deals. The room hadn't changed. Same long walnut table, polished to a shine so deep you could almost see your reflection if you dared to look. Same arched windows letting in the late morning light, and the same 12 leather chairs lined up like quiet sentinels around the perimeter. But something had changed. Grace Miller wasn't standing by the coffee tray this time. She was seated at the head of the table, A small silver plaque sat in front of her chief strategy officer, engraved just the week before. To her left was Benjamin Lockridge, dressed impeccably as always, though his expression held something softer, now less guarded, more present. To her right sat three executives from Overline Group, a European tech conglomerate whose partnership would inject both capital and credibility back into Lockridge Holdings. And Grace quiet, calm. Grace was the one leading the conversation. Her fingers rested lightly on a yellow notepad. No slideshow, no theatrics, just her voice, steady and composed, weaving strategy and vision into a pitch no one in the room had expected from a woman they had once mistaken for background noise. "We're not here to talk about fixing a company," she began, looking each guest in the eye. "We're here to talk about building one better than it's ever been." There was no tremble in her voice, no trace of nerves. She had practiced, yes, but more than that. She believed what she was saying, and that belief resonated like quiet music in the room, tuning every ear toward her. She spoke of integration, not just of technologies and markets, but of people, about cultural alignment, about dignity in business. "We're not interested in growing fast if it means leaving our values behind," she said. "This partnership isn't about size, it's about synergy." Across the table, the CEO of Everline, a silver-haired Frenchwoman named Elise Dubois, nodded with approval. "I've been in this industry 30 years, Elise said, folding her hands, "and I've sat through 1,000 pitches, but I haven't heard someone speak like that in a very long time." Grace smiled, grateful, but not flattered. She had earned this. Benjamin remained mostly quiet throughout the meeting. A few years ago, that would have been unthinkable. The Benjamin of old would have dominated the room, controlled the agenda, made sure every eye was on him. But now, he leaned back slightly in his chair, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering a thought, but always deferring to Grace. He wasn't stepping aside out of guilt anymore. He was stepping aside because he trusted her, and it showed. He watched as the Everline executives leaned forward when Grace spoke, taking notes, asking questions. She answered them all, sometimes with numbers, sometimes with stories. She used no jargon, no sales tricks, only truth, clearly spoken. As the meeting drew to a close, contracts were laid out on the table, fresh ink, waiting. Grace glanced at Benjamin. He gave her a small nod. With quiet confidence, she picked up the pen. Her signature was fluid, firm. A round of applause followed, not loud, not staged, but sincere. Outside the conference room, the hallway buzzed with low conversation. A few junior analysts peeked in through the glass, trying to catch a glimpse of the signing. A reporter from Business Herald lingered near the reception, camera slung across his shoulder. When Grace stepped out, he approached gently. "Miss Miller," he said, "I know this isn't a press event, but may I ask one question for our upcoming profile?" She paused, adjusting the folder in her arms. "What's the question?" "What do you think saved Lockridge Holdings?" She looked past him, for a brief moment toward the space outside the office where she once sat, day after day, year after year, where she once booked flights, fixed schedules, reprinted slide decks, where she had once been mistaken for a secretary even by the janitor who cleaned the place. And then she looked back. "Clarity," she said, and finally being allowed to use it. The reporter scribbled, "They're calling you the strategist who saved Lockridge." "Do you agree with that?" She gave a gentle, almost wistful smile. "I didn't save the company," she said. "I just reminded it what mattered." That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the last of the guests departed, Grace walked the hallway alone. She passed the glass-paneled doors, the whiteboards filled with strategy notes, the quiet hum of the HVAC. She paused by her old desk, the one just outside Benjamin's office. The chair was still there, though no one had used it since she left. She reached out, brushing her fingers across the edge of the desk. 7 years. She had been invisible here for 7 years. And yet, she had seen everything, remembered everything. The missed birthdays, the overnights, the small kindnesses no one noticed. Now, She stood taller, not because she had something to prove, but because she had nothing left to hide. She made her way back to her office. Her office. The nameplate on the door gleamed under the warm lights. Grace Miller, CSO. She stepped inside, placed her folder on the desk, and exhaled. She wasn't just part of Lockridge Holdings. She was part of its future, and she had one more card to play. Tomorrow, she'd attend the Global Leadership Summit on behalf of the company, a stage once reserved for Benjamin. But this time, she'd be the one standing at the podium, and she wasn't going there alone, because some victories are best shared. She left in silence. Now, they stand up when she walks in. 6 months had passed, but in some ways, it felt like years. The headquarters of Lockridge Holdings, once cold and clinical, now hummed with a quieter, more purposeful energy. There was laughter in the corridors again, birthday cards taped to cubicles, feedback boxes that people actually used. The light in the building seemed different. Or maybe it was just that people had finally looked up. Grace Miller walked through the glass doors of the International Business Ethics Forum, held at the Marriott Marquis in Times Square. She wore a slate blue dress, simple, elegant, and a name badge that now drew more attention than any title ever had. Grace Miller, Chief Strategy Officer, Lockridge Holdings. She had come a long way from pouring coffee. Beside her walked Benjamin Lockridge, dressed in charcoal gray, no tie this time, more relaxed, more open. His gait slower, more measured. He had learned how to listen, and perhaps more importantly, how to share the stage. They were scheduled to speak on the final day of the forum, a keynote titled, Rebuilding from Within, How Culture Saved a Company. The conference hall was packed. Executives, journalists, students, former skeptics who had watched the headlines shift over the past half year. Grace took her seat on the stage to a ripple of applause. Not roaring, not obligatory, but real. It was Benjamin who opened the session. He stepped to the podium and looked out over the crowd. There was a quiet tension in the room, people waiting for the polished billionaire to give another rehearsed speech. But he surprised them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old post-it note, yellowed at the edges. He held it up. This was the last note Grace Miller left me before I fired her. It says, "Take care of yourself. You forget sometimes." The room stilled. That wasn't just about health or rest, he continued, voice steady. It was about who I had become. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what leadership meant. I thought power was in control. Grace showed me it's in trust. He turned to her, eyes meeting hers across the stage. I used to be the CEO of Lockridge Holdings, but Grace Miller is the one who saved it. The applause this time was louder. Grace stood, walked slowly to the podium. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She simply arrived with the grace her name promised, and the quiet strength that had carried her through every dark hallway she had ever worked in. I didn't come back to prove anything, she said softly. I came back because I believed the company could be better, not just in profit margins, but in how it treated its people. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. This isn't a revenge story. I didn't rebuild to show them. I rebuilt because I chose not to be bitter. I chose to be better. But I only did that because someone finally said, "You matter here." And she turned to Benjamin. The gesture was small, but the meaning wasn't. After the session, reporters gathered. "What inspired your return?" one asked. Grace smiled gently. "Forgiveness," she said. But not just toward him, toward myself, for staying silent too long, for not knowing my worth sooner, but now I do. Another journalist leaned forward. "And what's next for Lockridge Holdings?" Benjamin stepped in. "We're focusing on mentorship, on building leaders who aren't afraid to say, 'I was wrong.'" That's the culture Grace brought back, one of humility and resilience. And then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, "Can we get a photo of the two of you?" Grace hesitated. For a moment, she saw herself again, standing just out of frame, holding a clipboard, adjusting someone else's mic. But not anymore. She nodded, took her place beside Benjamin. This time, shoulder to shoulder, and smiled. That night, after the long day of panels and handshakes, she returned to her Brooklyn apartment. The place was still modest, still home. But now it held a framed newspaper clipping by the window, the strategist who saved Lockridge Holdings. Below it, a simple quote etched into the frame. Leadership is not about being the loudest in the room. It's about being the one who listens first. She curled into her chair with a cup of tea. The city buzzed softly outside. There were no more post-it notes, no more silence, just the sound of her own breath, calm, steady. She had left in the shadows, forgotten. But now, when she entered a room, people stood up, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it, and that, more than any title, was what she had always deserved. In a world that often praises loud voices and fast decisions, this story reminds us of the quiet power of integrity, consistency, and human dignity. Grace Miller wasn't the loudest person in the room, but she was the one holding it together. When she was pushed aside without a second thought, everything began to unravel, not because she was irreplaceable, but because she had been undervalued for far too long. We all know someone like Grace. Maybe we have been Grace doing the unseen work, putting others first, staying silent when we should have spoken up. The true lesson here is twofold. For leaders, never confuse someone's silence for insignificance. And for those in the shadows, never underestimate your worth just because others do. Respect isn't built in titles or office walls. It's built in the way we show up every day with care, with strength, and with purpose. No matter your age, it's never too late to reclaim your voice. And sometimes, the greatest form of justice is choosing to rise with grace. Thank you for spending your time with us and walking through this journey of resilience and redemption. If this story touched your heart, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.